long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. I'm here today with Chris Beam and Michael Berkman from Penn State's McCourtney Institute for Democracy and hosts of the Democracy Works podcast. And I thought that since this will be going out to both of our audiences, there are going to be a lot of people who won't be familiar with either you guys or with me. And so maybe we could start by, saying a little bit about our backgrounds, our respective podcasts, that sort of thing. So, Chris, Michael, what do you think? Does that sound good for you?
Sounds fine. Who do you want to start?
Why don't you guys start? Go ahead.
Well, so we've been doing this now for about 2 years almost, yeah? And we call ourselves at the McCourtney Institute Partisans for Democracy, and our idea was always that we don't want to take sides, but we do want to defend democracy, its institutions, and especially in the current climate, kind of stick up for democracy whenever we can. And that means helping people kind of understand at a higher level what's going on, at a more abstract level. Not so much the horse race, not so much the news, or at least the daily kind of news cycle, but more about what is going on and how does it impact democracy and how do we understand it in terms of democracy.
Yeah, so Mike, that was Chris. This is Michael. And one thing we try to do, therefore, is to have on guests who are involved in democracy in some way. Some of them are, sometimes we have on people who are within government doing the hard work of democracy. At other times, we have on activists. We have on scholars who are studying different aspects of democracy. We have on journalists who cover democracy and politics. We have on people that are area experts on other countries which are undergoing their own struggles with democratic erosion. So we have our guests, and we try to have some discussion about what the issues they raise about democracy are and why they're important.
Yeah, and I think that's just so important because it's easy to get lost in the day-to-day and not, be able to pull back and look at our democratic institutions. And that's one of the reasons why I was so excited about having a chance to talk with you guys, because on the Politics Guys, we're very much, we do a lot of the day-to-day, kind of a weekly, review of what's been going on from a bipartisan perspective. We always have someone from the left, and usually that's me, or someone from the right on. And while we do some interviews and so forth with people who can kind of pull back, we're much more day-to-day or week-to-week oriented. And I think having that again, ability to pull back and look at that is so important. And given, as you said, what's been going on, I thought this really raises some very important questions about our institutions and how they function. There's been all this talk about, constitutional crises and so forth. And so this is a great, in a weird way, a great moment for us to maybe be having this conversation. And one thing, I realized that 2 of our last 4 presidents now have been through impeachment proceedings, and 3 of our last 9. And to me, that sounds kind of unusual, I would say. And I was wondering what you guys thought. What does that tell us about the moment that we're in, or the era that we're in?
I think at some level, you're right. There is something distinctive about politics right now. I don't know that it's reasonable to expect that the phenomenon of impeachment would be any different from a lot of other challenges and undermining of norms throughout kind of the democratic process. And given the fact that you have such a hyper-partisan electorate, and you have such a knife edge in terms of balance of power within the electorate, it just kind of, within the government, it kind of stands to reason that impeachment is going to be yet another manifestation of that broader phenomenon.
Yeah, Mike, it could also be presidential power is much greater now than it used to be. And so presidents may push what it is that they can do more than they might have in the past. When I was thinking about this question, you had told us about it in advance. And, I think of this impeachment as much more like Nixon's impeachment than it is like Clinton's, in that both dealt with a president abusing his power in pursuit of damaging a potential political opponent. Clinton's, I think, was of a whole different thing because Clinton's behavior wasn't really related to his powers as president or his behavior as president. So maybe the connection between Nixon and Trump is Roger Stone.
Yeah, I guess so. Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure you guys have been watching, obviously, all of the media coverage of things and so forth. And that point you made earlier about it being perhaps the reason we have more of these impeachments is we have a much more powerful presidency. I think that's a viewpoint that we haven't heard a lot. I think there was an article maybe a couple weeks ago I saw, it was either Reason or some kind of Cato libertarian sort of thing making that same argument. And it's interesting to me that in all the talk about this, we don't really tend to look at maybe some of those, institutional structural factors as to why impeachment might be more likely today than when the presidency was far less powerful.
It stands to reason, right?
Yeah,
I mean, you also have a Congress that is far more oriented towards party than it is towards defense of itself as an institution.
Right. What was it that Charlie
Dent?
Yeah, that Charlie Dent told us when he was here. So Charlie Dent, the former Republican congressman from Pennsylvania who left in 2018, told us that one of his concerns is that many in the Republican Party don't see themselves as protecting or speaking for Congress, but rather protecting and speaking for Trump. And so, given that, I think you're going to have this highly partisan kind of environment where.
Yeah, he actually said something really interesting that hadn't occurred to me. It's almost like we have more of a parliamentary system of government with just two parties. And so that's not a great recipe for defending.
Well, not in a divided system, not in a divided power system.
Right.
I mean, the thing about parliamentary systems is that the executive is not usually separate from the.
And usually has
the parliament.
less power. But it just stands to reason that you're going to have more, almost exclusive focus on the president when Congress sees itself as acting as an agent of the president and the president's party.
Right. When you have a situation where separated powers actually means one party has one institution and another party has another, it's kind of. I don't think we should be that surprised that they push it to the extremes of their power. In that kind of conflict.
I really feel like this is something that maybe, I don't know if I'd say that the framers got wrong, but it seems to me that they built a system based on an assumption of institutional struggle. But really what we have now is a system based on party struggle. And so you could take that a step further and say, well, given that, maybe we don't have the ideal institutional setup for kind of how this is broken down.
They should have foreseen the formation of parties. It came about very quickly. But they really designed a system that didn't really seem to incorporate consideration of parties.
Absolutely.
The other thing that adds to this is just the decline of any sense of my opponent is merely my opponent and not my enemy. Or maybe it's the rise of the alternative position where if my opponent were able to achieve power, it would be a disaster for the country. And the more people understand that point of view, the more people who reflect that point of view, the harder it is for anything to happen in Congress. And so that leads to, inevitably, the executive branch taking on more power. So this kind of thing just I think, feeds on itself. And so, again, not a surprise that we're where we are.
And I think you see a lot of that obviously in the media coverage. I mean, I've been going some back and forth and sort of the worldview that you get on this from, the Fox News front page or as opposed to MSNBC. It's just, it makes your head spin. And sometimes I wonder the extent to which the members of Congress who are pushing these narratives actually believe what they're saying, or if they're just basically playing to what they know the media audience is going to be there, or if it's just maybe a self-reinforcing kind of thing.
I certainly think you see more on the Republican side of playing to the particular Republican media or conservative media than you necessarily do on the Democratic side. But I see some of the antics that have gone on at the hearings by the Republicans in particular what are those things intended to accomplish? Other than to make some kind of stink on Fox News in the evening, I don't see any purpose to it.
You know, Jeff Flake, they asked him, is it true that you think if it was a secret ballot that, you know, Trump would get 30 votes? And he said, yeah, or 35. And he said, no, at least no more than 30. And if that's true, I mean, it kind of got a laugh. If it's true, I don't know that I think that's funny.
Yeah.
I think it just kind of bespeaks the fact that people are more concerned with their own constituency, their own survival in office, than they are with any other dimension.
Yeah, bothers me less because impeachment's a political process. It's not a judicial process.
Right. That's absolutely true. However, I mean, and Charlie Dent said, you know, you're not seeing profiles of courage. If you're looking for that, you should just go look elsewhere, right?
I also think we don't know yet. I mean, in the Republican House, we have to remember that the Republican House members are, for the most part, with some exceptions, obviously, but for the most part, especially after 28, you know, dealing with some pretty conservative districts. A lot of the more moderate districts, or at least competitive districts, got washed out in 2018. There's still some out there, but a lot of them got washed out. You know, and the more that happens, of course, the more conservative that Republican coalition, the more kind of committed to Trump, I think, that Republican coalition in the House is going to become. The thing that strikes me about the Senate is the silence. You know, I mean, with the exception of, you know, Ron Johnson on the Sunday shows and Lindsey Graham and some of the others, there's been a lot of no comment from Republican senators. So I think the verdict is still out.
Well,
the verdict is still out.
The verdict hasn't even been drawn yet, right?
on what we're going to see from some of the Republicans.
I mean, I wonder though if at least both in the House and in the Senate, the argument, or maybe you'd call it a rationalization, is not so much that, you know, these are folks who are saying, I don't care about the institution so long as I have my political survival. But maybe it's more of a case of, well, if this goes down and the president's impeached, this will be a disaster for the party. And then Democrats will get in and there will be all kinds of awful policies and they'll appoint these horrible judges. And so therefore, I actually am looking out for the greater good. And so our institutions may take a short-term shot, but they're strong enough, they're resilient enough, and Donald Trump is kind of a one-off, unusual person, and it'll all be fine in the long run.
Yeah, you know, I have no problem with that position on the part of Republican senators and House members. They are, they are elected officials. What concerns me a little bit more, though, is their refusal to stand up for the prerogatives of Congress, because I think that's going to have long-term implications in terms of subpoenas, in terms of testimony from people around Donald Trump, or even not really around Donald Trump, who aren't being allowed to testify. They're not standing up for that, and that I think is going to be really problematic in the long term.
I mean, I guess they've stood up in some other ways, like when they pushed on some veto overrides. Now, there haven't been the votes to actually override the vetoes, but there have been majorities for at least a couple of the president's vetoes, and so there's that. So they're not completely laying over, playing dead, that sort of thing.
Around
policy, exactly.
Around policy. But I'm talking about the fact that we're seeing, an unprecedented level of obstruction against congressional prerogatives for oversight, for subpoenas. And that's where the Republicans' behavior in the House and the Senate is a little bit more concerning, that they're not standing up a bit more for the privileges of the House to get a hold of, to have their subpoenas be recognized.
Absolutely. So how do you guys see sort of the best case outcome of this entire process? And I don't mean from a partisan standpoint, who wins and who loses, but at this point, what's the outcome you think that does the least long-term damage to kind of the legitimacy of our system, our institutions? Is there even an outcome at this point that would be that, like that? Do you think?
Well, I have a couple of ideas along this line. I mean, one is that I hope that one thing that comes out of this is some education, some communication to the American public about what the bureaucracy does, about what the role of all these government officials is supposed to be. the fact that we have this apolitical bureaucracy intentionally. We had a whole progressive era to go over this stuff, right? To move away from machine politics, to move away from political control of the bureaucracy. So it would be nice to have some sort of for one thing to come out of this, for there to be some appreciation for what the role of these people might be in a democracy. I think we saw a little bit of that last week, actually. I think there's some other things that I hope to see come out of this too. I hope that whatever is decided is followed by both parties and by all the actors involved, that the decisions that are accepted. I mean, I think we're down a really bad road here on the way that congressional subpoenas are being completely ignored. And, I hope that we come out of this with a sense for Americans about why corruption is bad in a democracy. Yeah. And I think one thing that's really gotten lost is, what is this all about in the first place that we are having an impeachment hearing?
Right.
And, it is getting at fundamental notions of corruption concerning foreign powers that were a particular concern of the founders when they were putting the Constitution together.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think it's important that Americans understand what this is all about. And that is hard to communicate because of all the smoke and mirrors.
I think in terms of the difficulty of communicating it, there's this sense, certainly on the right, that anyone who pushes back against the president in the executive branch is part of the deep state. And some, I think, have argued, well, no, that's just how the bureaucracy works, no matter who the president is. And it's one thing to, stage a coup. It's something else to just kind of engage in your due diligence or your duty as a bureaucrat, as another official who also has a duty to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I think that kind of gets lost in the shuffle there, that this is kind of how the bureaucracy operates no matter who the president is.
Right. This coup language makes me crazy, because if Trump is impeached, it's not like Hillary Clinton's coming into
Right.
office. This idea that somehow the election is being overturned, that's not going to happen at all. If Donald Trump is impeached, then Mike Pence takes office. And it's hardly a coup and hardly a renunciation of the election. Now, I appreciate the depth of Donald Trump's support in the public, and that it could well be perceived this way. But I think that's important. Along the lines, too, of this deep state idea, I hope that one thing that comes across here is the idea that in a democracy, as opposed to an autocracy, government employees take an oath to the Constitution, not to the leader. And now the president doesn't accept this. And, that's his business and that's his privilege. But I do think it's the responsibility of others who are involved in this process to say that's not actually the way things work in a democracy.
I think there are a lot of people who feel like the president is an elected autocrat, basically, and once you win the election, it's your government to do with as you wish until you are taken out of office through being unelected or being defeated for re-election or serving your 2 terms, which obviously isn't how the system's designed.
It goes much deeper than that. I mean, there's this fundamental notion in Donald Trump's metaphysics that the world is transactional.
Yeah.
Right. That there is simply a matter of you. Bargaining, making a deal, and getting what you want. And what you're seeing from these bureaucrats, which when often that word is thrown around, it's an epithet, right? It's a bad thing. But you see these people who have taken oaths, who are committed to public service, who try to behave with honor and rectitude, and those things just are not. And I would love to hear a counter argument to that, right? I mean, I'd love to hear someone who saw this testimony and didn't come away with that, or with that impression. And in Donald Trump's worldview, there just is no place for that. There's no legitimacy to that. It's simply a matter of getting what you want through the actions of another, by coming to an agreement with another. And I think that is, in some ways, the worst thing that is coming out of this presidency, because it's almost impossible to sustain a democracy unless there is some common sense of honor, of saying what you believe, of making a commitment and then coming through with it, right? And so anyway, I mean, here endeth the sermon, but...
Well, the most concerning part about the transactional nature of his politics, I mean, on the one hand, people knew what they were getting. Maybe that's why they wanted a business person. They thought he would bring that in, right? But I think it's important that people understand that at least in this case of Ukraine, and I would suspect in some other areas as well, these transactions are for his personal political gain, not promoting the national interest. I mean, that is the core of what's going on here, is that a foreign country was asked to interfere in our elections to help the president's reelection chances, and that he used the power of his office to extract that favor from another country. Now, he didn't get it because the whistleblower, but nonetheless, that is what he tried to do. I think that's a form of corruption that is extremely dangerous in a democracy.
And one that was explicitly addressed within
because they understood
framers.
Right, because they understood how corrosive it is.
Right.
I mean, if you do not expect that your elected leaders are acting in are acting in the interests of the country, you have some fundamental issues in a democracy.
And so the argument is, I mean, and I think you're getting more and more of this from the Republicans, is it was bad, but it's not impeachable. Right. As if to say we are defining deviancy down in the, God bless him, Pat Moynihan, right? The idea
There's a phrase that keeps on giving.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we are getting to the point where what used to be absolutely scandalous has now become, well, it's just the way politics is. And if that's true, and if we have to be realistic about this, and we don't even affirm the idea that there are ideals, that there are standards, then it becomes very difficult over time to sustain a democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's still some open question to this. We all know that Donald Trump's defied norms right and left and all this. But what happens, going forward? And to some extent, certain norms, once they've been broken, they're never coming back. Others may just be codified. And therefore, I wouldn't be surprised at some point that we see some kind of law that candidates have to show their tax returns. We're already seeing it in some states. That would be sort of codifying the norm that he broke. But there really is the risk that some of this will just be seen as how we do things going forward.
I mean, the corruption part of it obviously is bad, but what concerns me more as an institutionalist is the other part of it is the not that the Republicans and the president are saying, well, they don't have a case, but that, no, the very investigation, the very exercise of this authority is illegitimate, is fake, is a sham, is a witch hunt. And that to me is the deeper problem that I'm concerned might, resonate.
Getting back to the media, that would be a useful thing to be emphasized. Of course, this is their right and prerogative, and some might argue their responsibility.
But I think, and that's the problem, right, is that trying to focus on process arguments and that sort of thing, that tends to be not really in the wheelhouse of most media these days. Not very, so I think that's a big problem there.
It is really hard to take a step back when there's so much stuff happening every day, right? And so it is very difficult to keep your perspective. I find it very difficult.
Yeah, the rate of news is remarkable. And of course, you asked about, you started all this with some of these past impeachments, and of course, one of the great differences is now the rise of this more segmented media. And so, one thing that you don't have that you really had in, say, the Nixon impeachment is sort of one voice coming out to Americans. 3 channels, but they're all saying basically the same thing about what it is that's going on. And so now you have this sort of epistemological kind of conflict where each side sees an entirely different world.
Yeah.
And that is, that is problematic.
It becomes, again, very difficult for democracy.
This is very damaging.
Mike, you were saying how, you watch the competing coverage and it makes your head spin. I watch the competing coverage and it leads me to despair. No. If these two worldviews, these two ways of seeing the same reality are so different that there's literally where do you start to try to bring these two factions together, not in terms of objectives or in terms of morality, just in terms of what, like Michael said, epistemology. What are the facts here?
Yeah.
If we can't get to that, again, sustaining a democracy becomes very difficult.
It's even rough when you have people who want to engage in this. I mean, because that's what we do on the Politics Guys pretty much every week. My conservative co-host and I, and still we will have moments where it just seems like we're talking past each other. And, oftentimes I'm hosting with somebody I've known for 20 plus years, a guy of good intentions, but he's in his universe and I'm in mine. And if it's that difficult for us, how difficult it's got to be for, everyone else who, isn't that committed to that. It's just, it can lead you to despair, I think. And it seems to me that where we're headed here with this particular process is, I don't see a real viable path to anything but a party line vote in both chambers. And that really concerns me, quite a lot. I mean, maybe I'm holding out for Mitt Romney or Susan Collins or something like that, but I think that's maybe hoping against hope.
I think that, especially looking in the Senate, that there are a fair number of senators facing either, competitive races in purple, if not blue states, as well as some senators just leaving the chamber who we really have not heard very much from. So I'm not completely convinced that the vote will be straight party line. I think there's a probability well above zero that it won't be. But I'm not naive either. I think there's certainly in the House, there's a real good chance it will be. But in the Senate, I think that even just looking at their own electoral dynamics, I just find it hard to believe, for example, that, a Susan Collins and a Joni Ertz and a Cory Booker and a senator from North Carolina whose name is slipping me right now, Tillis, right?
Yeah, Tillis,
are going to find it so easy to vote against impeachment.
It is. You just had. Don't want to read too much into it, but you just had Kentucky and Louisiana. I think the argument or the presumption that if you don't cohere or affirm Donald Trump and his narrative, that you're going to lose. I don't know that necessarily get you over the finish line the way it did maybe 2 years ago. And if that's the case, then if it is indeed the case that these politicians are operating solely according to their self-interest, if it were to be the case that their self-interest perception is going to change, well, then all bets are off.
Yeah, I also think that from the leadership's perspective, a straight party line vote might not be actually what they need. And in other words, McCarthy and McConnell might both feel at some point that they've got to let some of their members just do what they need, even while they whip it to know that they've got the votes that they need. So that would come across, right? You know what I mean there, Mike? So it might come across as a bipartisan vote. They got some Republican votes. It doesn't mean it's going to put them over the top. But I could easily see McConnell telling some of his members, vote the way you feel like you need to vote, because the most critical issue for us, from McConnell's perspective or McCarthy's, is trying to retain or gain back control.
But and from a kind of strategic Republicans-Democrats standpoint, more from kind of a legitimacy standpoint, I just think having a straight party line vote either way, whether it's is essentially. Yeah, that basically says that impeachment is a completely partisan thing and has nothing to do really with whether the president did it or not, or whether it was, worthy of removal or not. It's just about, well, I vote for my party and I vote against the other guy. And that's, to me, the really damaging thing.
It delegitimizes not just the process, but the institution.
It'll also speak a lot to the president's political power if he's able to keep them together
absolutely.
That way. Because clearly that is of great importance to Donald Trump, is to have straight party line votes, because he would much rather take that into the campaign than having lost Republicans on the impeachment issue.
Do you guys think that, impeachment as a process, it was obviously set up for a very different political world. And sometimes you mentioned, one you mentioned, I forget, if there were a secret vote, I think Flake said that, there would be, the vote would be very different. And, that makes me wonder, is this is this the process we need in cases where, given how polarized we are, or would a different process serve us better? And of course, that's sort of way out there because it's not like we're going to amend the Constitution anytime soon. But I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, one thought is, I guess they do have some other options, right? They could vote censure at the end, or something like that, something short of
the base would love that.
And, I wouldn't rule that out completely, but it would help a lot if the courts would rule on this Department of Justice finding or holding that a president can't be indicted. If you think about the Mueller report, that whole report was just kind of jammed up because of Mueller's conviction that the DOJ has a rule that you can't indict the president. And we've seen this come up in multiple cases that are working their way through the courts. I guess maybe mostly those New York cases, but there's some others as well. And if, remember, the courts have never ruled on this. They did rule that Clinton had to testify in a civil case having to do with Paula Jones, I believe. But there's been no particular ruling on this idea that a president can't be indicted. If he could, then that might open up another sort of avenue. But right now, the DOJ obviously is not going to do that anyway, but is also, constrained from its perspective right now, to its advantage with not being able to
I feel like there's that other question too of whether or not the executive branch immunity sort of overrides the ability of Congress to call certain witnesses and testify. Because I think certainly I would like to hear what Mulvaney and Giuliani and Bolton and some other folks have to say, and I get the sense that that might not actually happen because that's an unresolved issue as well.
Well, sure. I mean, obviously, they've made a decision at the White House that it is not in their interest to have these people testify, nor is it in their interest to.
I can't imagine why they're.
Yeah, exactly. Nor is it in their interest to even in any way legitimate this process. Now that doesn't mean that gets them off the hook, right? I mean, obstruction of justice was one of the articles brought against Nixon, and if you are going to just completely subvert this process at every step, I don't know how you could avoid that, right? I don't know how you can fail to bring that kind of charge. And the only other thing I wanted to say about the impeachment is, this is the process. And given that it is the process, then I think it's incumbent upon Democrats, i.e. the ones bringing these starting this inquiry, to be as deliberate and by the books as they possibly can. And I think you see that in the way Schiff is handling this. Whether you think he's doing a good job in terms of, achieving the end of impeachment or not, I think for the sake of the institutions we're talking about, it's at least as important and probably more that he adhere to the demands of this process.
I agree with that. I think it's, I understand why Schiff is doing this and Pelosi is doing this, but I think there are costs to it, and that is they feel like they need to move this through quickly, right? And that means that they've basically taken the courts out of the process because courts simply don't move quickly, and they don't really move on anybody else's schedule. Mm-hmm. So whereas, if you go back to the Nixon impeachment, the fact that the Supreme Court came out and said you have to release those tapes, I mean, that was significant. That just changed everything.
And Bush v. Gore in Florida, right? That was a big deal. I mean, and it came up really quickly.
And it came up, but I see nothing to suggest that the courts are eager to move quickly now. And in fact, I suspect that Schiff withdrew the subpoena from Bolton's deputy, Sugarman. I apologize. I can't remember his name. And decided not to subpoena Bolton in the first place because they didn't want to wait. That's
my one concern. My biggest concern, I guess, with how they're handling it is I get the argument that, well, if you push this too far into the 2020 election cycle, then it causes all sorts. Yeah, it causes problems. And then, of course, you have that argument of, well, let's just let the people decide because we're going to have a vote anyway on the presidency. But to me, that kind of does some potential damage to the integrity of the process as well. Because if you're so I mean, I'm not saying that both sides are equally to blame, but I am saying that I ideally would have wished that the Democrats had maybe worked more through the court system, even though we have this sort of unfortunate timing, I guess, from a political perspective, because this didn't come out, early enough for that to be politically viable.
From Schiff's perspective, he's just trying to build a case, and he may really well feel like he's got the case and doesn't really need the people. So it's not that, so there's been a lot of emphasis on Bolton, and everybody knows that Bolton would be one heck of an entertaining day in a congressional hearing. They have Fiona Hill. So I'm not convinced from an evidentiary perspective that they absolutely need them. They want to because everybody will watch.
And of course, while all this is going on, there's still government that needs to run. I mean, this happens right in the middle of, we still have to have a budget for the next fiscal year. And I think people tend to forget, too, with impeachment sort of basically dominating everything, that this is going on as well. I was wondering, what do you guys think in terms of how this affects all of the business of government that also has to, be conducted? I mean, it's certainly not a good thing.
I mean, Congress set up committees so that it could do multiple things at one time. That was the whole point of setting up a committee process when Congress first started operating and there was less to do, right? They did everything as a committee of the whole. Then they found that, specialization and expertise and being able to do multiple things at one time was a good thing. And so they set up a committee system. So, there's no reason that the budget committees and the appropriations committees can't be working on their legislation. Now, where I do think you're seeing a real problem of this is in the White House, because I don't think the White House is actually capable of governing and handling the impeachment at the same time. And that's a strategic decision, but strategic may be a little bit too much. That is a decision by the president to not go about the business of governing, but instead, you look at his schedule every day, he's not actually doing anything.
Well, I mean, but also you have more and more, you have Senator McConnell saying things like, well, we're not going to take anything to a vote that we don't have the president's pre-approval on, essentially. And so I'd say Mitch McConnell is at least somewhat to blame, and maybe he's doing that because he's recognized how erratic the president is in commitments, and he's trying to protect his members, and I get that, but I think he bears some responsibility here as well.
I think that's the broader point, I mean, the idea that, this might really gum up the works, it was not, this Congress was not exactly a picture of efficiency, beforehand, right? And the issues that, that the impeachment process might bring up, i.e. this kind of sense of enmity, animosity, less inclination to moderate or to compromise, all those things were there in spades long before this happened. So, I mean, I just find it not a very interesting argument.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, take the counterfact. Take the counterfactual. We're going into an election year, but there's no impeachment going on. Do you think either side is really eager to give the other side wins going into an election year?
That's a good point. Of course, I mean, there are certain things that you have to have action on, and the budget, the budget being one of them. So putting that right in the middle is certainly not a positive thing. That's for sure. But looking past this, I mean, there are some people who say, well, Donald Trump, he's an outlier, and we can expect a return to kind of more of a return to normalcy, whether it's 2021 or 2025. Only Donald Trump can get away with this sort of norm breaking and so forth. And I think there are a lot of Republicans who would like to believe this. But then there are some Republicans who say, you know what, this is a new era, a new time, and we're going to see just all-out war of all against all, and every president's going to be impeached from now on, and this is the beginning of the end. Maybe Andrew Sullivan, I know you guys had him on recently. It was a great interview, and I think he ended the interview with saying, well, he thinks this is pretty much the end for liberal democracy, I guess, and where do you guys fall on that? I mean, are you more optimistic about that or not so much?
Yeah, so I mean, on the sense of impeachments, Obama wasn't impeached, and they couldn't find anything on him.
Not to say that they wouldn't have if they.
But they couldn't find anything on him. So I mean, one lesson there is don't be corrupt and have really good White House counsel who instruct you on how to behave properly, and you could keep yourself out of trouble. But I think maybe the larger issue here is what is the consequence for the Republican Party of this impeachment? So if there is no consequence, then I think you're right. They just see it, we'll do this too, and we can just do what we want, and we'll be in this perpetual battle. But if they do take a beating for it, which I think is not outside the realm of possibility, I'm not predicting it, I just think it's not outside the realm of possibility, and it's a much smaller Republican Party, then maybe there'll be some thought about going forward.
Do you? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Exactly. I don't feel like.
Well, I think a good beating does lead political parties to have to reappraise a little bit.
Of course. But there was a memo that came out after Romney's defeat in which the Republicans said, "Here's all the things we have to do."
Well, that was wrong,
and they did exactly the opposite, and they got reelected.
Yeah.
Right. So the point is,
the point is avoid your consultants.
Happen, And anybody who has any confidence in either a pessimistic or an optimistic point of view, I think, is
but you're missing
mistaken.
You're missing my point. They will know full well if they took a beat.
Well, yeah.
Oh, sure.
Okay. I mean, if they lose the Senate, which is within the realm of possibility, if they lose the White House, and if their House majority were to continue to shrink until it's really just sort of the hardcore
state legislatures,
and they take some beatings in the states, which might also be possible because they have a lot of vulnerable people there, given how many wins they had in the last 15 years. Then maybe there'll be some self-reflection and new leadership that emerges. I don't know that will happen. I just think that taking an electoral beating is something that could potentially lead to something.
It could be, but it could also just reinforce and cauterize this sense of outrage and disconnection and enmity towards the other. Right? You have a stronger Republican Party, a stronger base that is more associated with sense of resentment. I mean,
you also have really severe delegitimation of some governing institutions,
and so
that is going to be very hard to come back from.
Regardless, this is not going to just turn on a dime. The idea that once Donald Trump is out of office, everything's going to go back the way it was. I just think that's just.
Well, yeah,
that is naive.
Again, not what I'm saying, but
yeah.
But I wonder if it's a case where you need both the environment and the individual. And Donald Trump was either the right or the exactly wrong man at the right time, essentially to take advantage of our moment in time. And whether or not, absent unique personality like Donald Trump, how likely it is that we're going to have more people who come up in either the Republican or Democratic Party say, well, this is the way to do it, to basically forget about all the norms and to just ram through as sort of authoritarian populist sort of leadership, whether it's on the left or the right. And to me, that's maybe the greater concern, that perhaps our system is vulnerable to that sort of thing because of the polarization that we see. And, do we have more Donald Trumps waiting in the wings who've learned that lesson and will, sweep in after this? And that's my concern, I guess.
Well, and who could be far more strategic, far more politically savvy than Donald Trump was, right? And if that were to be the case, then like a Putin type of person. You see that in other if you take countries.
If you take Putin's sort of strategic knowledge and put it into Donald Trump and have that person running things, well, there'd be all this corruption, but we wouldn't know anything about it because the people would be much more competently corrupt, I would think. So there's
And the people who were trying to bring that to people's attention would be in far more trouble
they'd disappear
than they
or
are
something.
Right now.
Yeah, exactly. That's my concern. So, well, let's not be maybe too pessimistic. I'm wondering, do you feel like there are real things, valuable things, not pie in the sky stuff that we can do to maybe make this less likely? I mean, I feel like that with both of our podcasts, we're kind of trying to do that, to get people in the case of the politics guys, sort of talking to each other from opposite sides, and in Democracy Works, sort of pull back and look at these bigger, more fundamental issues. But of course, our impact is sadly much more limited than we'd like it to be, right? I mean, and we see, whether it's the podcast world or the regular media world, where it's the extreme partisanship preaching to the choir that really gets all the virality. And so sometimes that depresses me a little bit. I mean, well, what do you guys think?
I think there's an audience these days for commentary that is not deep in the partisan mire, that people are actually taking a hard look on their democracy. I think that when they see democracy kind of threatened, then they sort of wake up a little bit. And I believe we've seen that over the last couple of years. I think we've seen it in the way that books like Democracy Dies moves to the top of the bestseller. How Democracies Die moves to the top of the New York Times bestsellers list. That podcasts on topics like this are, gaining an audience. People are listening. They're coming back week after week.
I think, you have to start with this. I mean, I think people have actually, Lauren Duca, we had her here a year ago, and she said, democracy is not a self-cleaning litter box. Yeah. And I think that's a really, really good phrase, because I think that's exactly how most Americans regarded it, right? That this was something that we had set in motion. We're all fine. We don't have to pay much attention to it. It doesn't require much of us. But if you go back to the founders, that's precisely not what they thought. And once you understand that democracy is not particularly natural, it requires skills and dispositions of us that have to be learned and taught, and it's hard, it's difficult to listen to someone with whom you disagree and come out of that without, coming to blows. Once you understand that, then I think, and I think people are more aware of those realities than they were, 3 years ago. And so because of that, I do think there is at least grounds for hope.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to Larry Lessig on the show a couple of weeks ago, and he said that one of the outcomes, I guess you could say, of the progressive movement is it put a greater burden on us as individuals to be more informed by making the system more small d democratic, and that does take quite a lot of work and much more impact much more effort than if we had a much more elitist system of government.
And it's still an open question whether or not people really want that or not. I mean, when Andrew Sullivan was here, I said, "Gosh, this reminds me of the Grand Inquisitor." That do people really want to be free? And that still may be the question.
I think that's a fair question. So for people who, and definitely I want to encourage all Politics Guys listeners to check out Democracy Works. I haven't heard an episode yet that I didn't think was well worth my time, but for people who haven't listened to Democracy Works yet, is there any place that you would recommend they jump in, or episodes that you feel particularly good about that would be a great starting point?
Well, sure. Great question, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
We did an interview with Nancy Rosenblum and her co-author
from
Russell Muirhead.
Nice, Jenna, pulling it out. We both were like,
who wrote an absolutely tremendous little book called.
A lot of people are saying
the new conspiracism in American politics, where they're talking about the rise of conspiracy theories and new sorts of conspiracy theories. But when they get into talking about sort of the epistemological disconnect among Americans right now, I think it is just very, very powerful stuff, and that they really isolate, first of all, why the spreading of conspiracy theories is so bad and so dangerous to a democracy, and it is, why it's especially bad when that is coming directly out of the White House, and what it means for democracy that some Americans are living in a conspiratorial world and others are living in a fact-based world. So I think I that's one of my favorites, and a book that really had an impact on me.
It's a really good book.
And the Andrew Sullivan one is very good too, because Andrew Sullivan is just sort of brilliant and interesting and provocative.
Yeah. I mean, the other one that comes to my mind is Larry Diamond. In his, he has a new book called Ill Winds, and it's a very brave book for an academic because he names names and he says this is bad. I'm not talking about in the United States. I'm talking about how he evaluates the threats of Russia and China to democracy, not just in the United States but throughout the world. And like I say, it's an impressive book for someone who is genuinely one of the leading figures in democracy in the academy for decades.
Oh, we should probably plug our only returning podcast,
That's true.
which is Laura Rosenberger, who's the director of the Alliance for Protecting Democracy at the German Marshall Fund in D.C.
And a proud alumna.
And a proud alum of Penn State, yeah. And, her sense of how authoritarian regimes try to interfere in democracies and wedge open existing conflicts and cleavages. So it's beyond just interfering in elections. It's an effort to sow chaos and discord more generally, is really, I think it's very interesting.
It's really interesting.
And important.
So not only is democracy really hard work, but there are people who are working very hard to undermine it. So it's good times.
And our format on the Politics Guys is a little bit different. We do kind of a combination of interviews and then a weekly review every weekend. But I'll plug a couple of places where people might want to start who are new to the Politics Guys. A couple weeks ago, I had an interview with Representative Thomas Massey, who I agree with on almost nothing related to policy. And it was such a great conversation because we talked largely about corruption in Congress. And he talked about, buying committee seats and things like that. And it kind of went in really well with my conversation I had the week after that with Larry Lessig. Of course, corruption, as you guys know, I'm sure, is one of his kind of key issues. And so you wouldn't necessarily put Thomas Massey and Larry Lessig in the same sentence, generally speaking. But it really worked out pretty well. And I have a conversation coming up. A returning guest, actually, Jacob Hacker, who I think has just done some amazing work on inequality and healthcare and a bunch of issues. And so I'm always excited when I get a chance to talk with him. And I'm guessing probably by the time this is up, that'll be up as well. So yeah. Well, hey, guys, I just wanted to thank you. This has been, I'm sure we could go on forever, but this has been a great conversation. And I know I enjoyed it. I hope you guys did.
Absolutely. Sure. It was lots of fun. Thank you.
And thanks for the work you're doing, too.
Take care, guys. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. We hope you liked what you heard. Listener support is what keeps the show going, and we truly appreciate it. When you become a monthly sustaining supporter of the show on Patreon, you don't just get our gratitude, you get a supporters exclusive bonus episode each and every week. Also, supporters at various levels can get additional bonuses like Politics Guys gear and access to a special supporters-only Facebook group. To learn more about all this stuff, go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can visit our website, politicsguys.com/support. Subscribing to the show also really helps, as does sharing episodes. Word of mouth is, of course, the best advertising, and we really would appreciate it if you tell folks about the show. Leaving reviews and ratings on whatever podcast app you use is also greatly appreciated. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do that at mail@politicsguys.com. There's also our Facebook page where you can message us, and where we're posting things throughout the week. It's facebook.com/politicsguys page. Finally, we're on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Benji Fishman, and Andra Masker. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.